Imagine wandering through the streets of London late at night in 1794. The air is heavy with coal smoke, and the cobblestones are slick with grime. Every face you pass, faces that seem to loom out of the night, is etched with fatigue and sorrow. In the distance, you hear a baby crying, and a chimney sweep coughs out a sob. This is the world of William Blake's poem, London. Blake knew these streets well. He lived in London and saw firsthand the poverty, child labour, and injustices around him. The late 18th century was a time of the Industrial Revolution and the aftermath of the American and the French revolutions. Blake himself was deeply critical of institutions like the monarchy, the church, and the government, especially when they ignored the suffering of ordinary people. London, the poem, was published in 1794 as part of his Songs of Experience, a collection meant to reveal the harsh realities of life, as opposed to the more hopeful innocence of some of his earlier poems. And indeed, London is one of Blake's most scathing works, a poem that seemingly has no silver lining, only the raw truth of oppression and injustice. In it, he invites the reader to walk with him and witness how thoroughly injustice permeates the city. His outrage, but also crucially his empathy, fuel every line. So in today's episode of Study Sessions, we're diving into the poem London, line by line. Our goal today is to understand how Blake uses incredibly vivid, powerful imagery and really biting critical language to critique those powerful institutions of his time. It's going to be a scholarly journey, but I'm going to try and hope that throughout this we maintain the intense drama of the poem too. And by the end, you'll see how the themes of power and oppression run through every line of the text. So, if we're going to understand the poem, we need to start with hearing it in its entirety. So I'm going to read through the poem, and as you listen, and obviously we've already explored this, you've studied this on multiple occasions with your classroom teacher, but as you hear it again and are reminded of the power of the verse, I want you to be thinking about what images, what ideas, what words stand out to you. I wander through each chartered street, near where the chartered Thames does flow, and mark in every face I meet marks of weakness, marks of woe. In every cry of every man, in every infant's cry of fear, in every voice, in every ban, the mine-forged manacles I hear. How the chimney sweepers cry, every blackening church appalls, and the hapless soldier's sigh runs in blood down palace walls. But most through midnight streets I hear how the youthful harlot's curse blasts the newborn infant's tear and blights with plagues the marriage hearse. It's grim and it's haunting. Still, hundreds of years after it first is published, Blake's words speak to us and expose London's misery. Now, what we're going to do is break it down, explore it stanza by stanza, line by line, to understand exactly how power and oppression shape every image and every line. So, stanza 1, chartered streets and those marks of woe. The poem opens, quote, I wander through each chartered street. Right away, Blake places us beside the speaker, walking through the city. And that word, chartered, it's absolutely crucial. It means officially owned, regulated, or mapped out, but by authority. Owned, regulated, mapped out by authority. By saying every street is chartered, therefore, Blake is suggesting that every part of the city has been claimed and is now owned by the powerful. He even goes one step further and says the chartered Thames does flow, implying that even the natural river, that image of freedom and graceful meandering, is not free from human control. And this is striking, really striking. Think of the river as a symbol of life and movement confined by legal ownership. Just as a quick side note, it's interesting that in the first draft of the poem, which we actually still have, Blake didn't use the word chartered, he used the word dirty to describe the Thames, but changed it. He obviously really wanted us to focus not on pollution, but on the idea of control and ownership. So that repetition of chartered allows Blake to drive home the feeling of pervasive, man-made or human-made restriction. Nothing in London, therefore, not even that natural river, is untouched by the influence of authority and commerce or money-making, profit-seeking. As the speaker wanders, and it's just a quick word on that wandering, this is a poem designed to allow us to experience the city, not trying to get from point A to point B, head down. It's a poem that allows us to experience, move through the city with Blake, as we know Blake himself did. So it's not about a specific direction, traveling with a destination in mind. It's a record of the experience of the city. And what does he notice? He notices, quote, "And mark in every face I meet marks of weakness, marks of woe." Now, Blake here uses the word mark as both a verb, to notice, but also as a noun, a mark as in a sign. And he does this back to back. Marks of weakness, marks of woe. Every face he sees bears the marks or signs of suffering. People look weak and full of woe or misery. The repetition, marks, marks, and the alliteration of weakness and woe give these lines a heavy and, depending on your interpretation, perhaps a mournful, or certainly my interpretation is a kind of indignation, an indignant tone. In other words, everyone in this city shows the effect of oppression. These aren't, therefore, personal failings. The people's weakness and sorrow, those are the result of living under an unrelenting burden. They aren't free. The stanza's form here also reinforces its message. We have that AB, AB alternating rhyme scheme, street, meet, flow, woe, and the use of a steady walking meter. Technically, it's called iambic tetrameter. We have 4 beats per line. The regular rhythm of the poem, at least for some, feels like the tread of footsteps through the street. What's interesting is that the form of the poem is neat and controlled, which is actually rather ironic since the poem, semantically, in terms of its meaning, contains such chaos and pain in its actual content. Blake might be subtly reflecting how an imposed order, the rhyme and the meter, just like the city's laws and the reference to chartered in that opening line, exists alongside the chaos of human misery. By the end of the first stanza, London has been depicted not as some pinnacle of civilization to be celebrated, but as a city where every street is controlled, owned, and every face reveals the human cost of that control. Now let's move on to stanza 2 and the "in every cry" repetition, as well as that famous, glorious, moving, thought-provoking reference to mind-forged manacles. The second stanza amplifies the sense of universal suffering established in stanza 1, quote, "In every cry of every man, in every infant's cry of fear, in every voice, in every ban, the mind-forged manacles I hear." Never get bored of reading that. That phrase, repeated again and again and again, it's anaphora, in every, hammers home that no one is exempt. Every man, every child, every voice in London is touched and marked by oppression. The speaker hears cries of fear everywhere. And then Blake delivers his famous metaphor, those mind-forged manacles. How many of our problems in life come from those mind-forged manacles? Now, manacles are like handcuffs or chains, and the word forged means either made or kind of fake. These are chains made in the mind. They're not physical chains, they're mental or psychological chains. And Blake is suggesting a number of things here. Firstly, clearly, that the people of London are psychologically shackled. Society's oppressive forces, the oppressive forces of authority, have not only physically restricted people, but they've shaped their minds. They've trapped or imprisoned their minds in these shackles or manacles. The word manacles itself evokes images of slavery and imprisonment. By saying they are mind forged, Blake is doing something really interesting here and very thought provoking. He's implying that people even help forge their own mental chains by internalizing and absorbing the beliefs and fears imposed by those in power. It's a really terrifying, really potent idea. An entire city of people held captive by ideas and resigned to, and in fact almost complicit in, their own bondage. Also notice in every voice, in every ban. Now, just like in the start of the poem, where we've got Blake playing with the word mark and the fact that mark can be used as a verb, but can also be used as a noun, Blake plays with the multiple meanings of the word ban. Now, the word ban can mean an official decree or a curse. Blake probably means both. Every voice is stifled by some law or some sort of prohibition. You know, the idea of banning something means that you're not allowed to legally do it. But it also, the word ban, and it's a meaning that we've sort of lost now in 2025, the meaning associated with it being a curse. So we've got the stifling sense of a law or a prohibition, but also that sense of a curse lying over the city. Every cry, every utterance in London carries, therefore, the weight of restriction. The sound of the poem, again, this is a really auditory poem. It's really important that we understand just how auditory this poem actually is. If we think of the alliteration in mind forged manacles, that rather heavy M sound, I think what it does is it makes the phrase itself perhaps sound heavy, like a chain being dragged. We might also, with that sound, almost hear the clinking of those mental chains. Blake, by saying, I hear, he gives the sense that the whole city is like a giant outdoor prison in which misery is echoing. By the end of stanza 2, we understand that the oppression is London. By the end of stanza 2, we understand that the oppression in London is not just on the streets, it's inside people's heads. Their very thoughts, their very voices have been shaped by tyranny. And this is a critique, I think, of how power can control not just bodies, but minds as well, which perhaps is the most insidious form of oppression. In the third stanza, Blake turns to specific institutions of power, the church and the monarchy particularly, and shows how they are complicit, perhaps even responsible, for the city's suffering. Quote, how the chimney sweepers cry, every blackening church appalls, and the hapless soldier's sigh runs in blood down palace walls. Now, first, that chimney sweepers cry. Chimney sweepers in Blake's London were often young children forced into really dangerous labour. Their pain represents, therefore, the most innocent victims of society. Blake says this cry appalls every blackening church. And I think this is an image that works on two levels. London's churches are literally blackening with soot from industry, and we've got the early stages of the Industrial Revolution and all of the pollution that we associate with that. But we've also got the idea of the church as an institution, as an organization, being figuratively or metaphorically blackened, growing corrupt and morally dark. The cry of the poor chimney sweeper should shame the church, and yet Blake implies that the church, which preaches charity, Christian charity, is, of course, horrified. There's a lot of hand-wringing about the child suffering, yet has not actually acted to stop it. The church is thus stained, or we might say blackened, by guilt. It's losing its moral purity by ignoring, or even condoning, such oppression. Next, that hapless soldier's sigh. The word hapless means unfortunate. The soldier is another victim, likely a young man sent to fight or die in the interests of or for the interests of the powerful. Blake says that the soldier's sigh runs in blood down palace walls. This is a really jarring, uncomfortable image. Suggests that the blood of these soldiers drips down the walls of the palace, symbolically marking the monarchy's guilt. The palace, home of the king and the government, is stained with blood, meaning the ruling class has blood on its hands. For a moment, picture that. The blood of the poor splashed on the pristine walls of royalty. It's horrifying. Blake may even here be hinting at a coming reckoning or a bloody violent revolution. The image, of course, evokes the French Revolution, where the aristocracy's palaces were literally attacked. Either way, he directly indicts, criticizes the state. These lines say the government and the crown are responsible for the violence and despair of their people. It's really significant that Blake chose these two examples, child labour and a soldier's sacrifice, to highlight religious and royal power. The church and the palace should, perhaps, stand for compassion and protection. Here they are agents of horror and moral decay. The third stanza makes it clear that those in power have failed utterly in their moral duty. The sacred is blackened, the mighty are bloodstained. Okay, we're going to turn to the fourth and final stanza now, thinking both about that harlot's curse and the marriage hearse too. The final stanza takes us to the dark streets at midnight and shows how deep the corruption runs right into family life itself. Now, just a quick word, there's a fantastic book called Night Walking by Matthew Beaumont, and it's called a Nocturnal History of London. And in this book, there's a section on Blake, and it is worth just reminding ourselves about this poem and about the fact it's set mostly at night, these midnight streets. Now remember, we're talking 1794, we're talking no electric lighting. We're thinking of a city, if we're thinking of 2025, where most areas of the city at night are illuminated by electric street lighting. Not so in the 1790s. Most streets, with the very odd exception, would be pretty much pitch black at night. And I think what that does, and this is something that Matthew Beaumont talks about, something that we should pay attention to. We just quickly go back to stanza 3. If you have a look, it's actually an acrostic. It spells out the word here. And this is a really auditory poem. It's a poem that gives us a kind of horrifying audio soundscape of the city at night if we actually really closely pay attention to it. But also to hear, to pay attention, to notice. So don't overlook the midnight streets. The lack of lighting, the darkness, takes away our sight, but might serve to heighten or accentuate the sounds of the city at night. So just don't forget that. It's a really, really important little observation. But that final stanza takes us to those dark streets at midnight, and it shows us how deep corruption is. Quote, "But most through midnight streets I hear how the youthful harlot's curse blasts the newborn infant's tear and blights with plagues the marriage hearse." So as I've said, it's really telling that this is a scene at midnight, that time of darkness and secrecy. Blake is pulling us in this moment into the shadows of the city, where the most distressing truths about poverty and power and oppression lurk. Here, as readers, we meet a youthful harlot, a young prostitute or sex worker, crying out a curse in the night. That word, the adjective youthful, makes us pity her even more. She might have been an innocent girl not long ago, now driven to this life by poverty and desperation. Her curse, whether it's her bitter words or the curse of her existence in society, is so harsh it blasts the newborn infant's tear. This likely means her anger or her suffering shatters the innocence of a crying baby. Perhaps the harlot has a baby of her own, and her outburst startles the infant's cries. Symbolically, even a newborn's sorrow is not spared from the corruption around it. From birth, then, the next generation is touched by the city's moral ugliness. Blake ends with a very ominous phrase, quote, "blights with plagues the marriage hearse." Now, the image of a marriage hearse is an oxymoron. It mixes a wedding, marriage, with a funeral vehicle, a hearse. Blake here is implying that marriage, which should symbolize love and new life, has become horribly entwined with death in this city. The word plagues suggests disease and corruption, possibly hinting at sexually transmitted diseases like syphilis, itself a rampant plague in that era that could turn love into tragedy. In Blake's London, the most sacred bond, marriage, is being destroyed. The harlot's presence brings illness and moral decay into marriages, turning what should be a joyful union into some kind of funeral. So, for example, a man's infidelity with a prostitute or sex worker might infect his wife with disease, literally making his marriage bed a deathbed. Thus, what should usher in new life, a marriage, instead ushers in death, a hearse. This final image is shocking and grim. Every hope, whether it's a new marriage, a new baby, is tainted, stained, blackened by the city's corruption. It underlines for the reader that the cycle of suffering continues unabated. Innocence is corrupted at birth. Love is infected at its core. Blake leaves us then with an auditory cityscape where the sins of the powerful have seeped into and shaped the lives of the powerless, poisoning even the things that should be sacred and joyful. Everything sacred, we might say, is profaned. Let's think, as we wrap things up, about power and oppression in the poem more generally. By the end of the poem, London, we've moved through the streets, the people, the institutions, and actually into the home. Blake methodically, relentlessly reveals that no place and no person in the city escapes these chains of oppression. Each stanza spotlights a different angle, the overall atmosphere of control, the cries of the people, the guilt of the institutions, and the infection, perhaps literally and morally, the infection of private life. William Blake's London, then, is a powerful indictment of how power structures can poison and plague every aspect of life. Just to highlight a few quick takeaways, then, about that theme of power in the poem. Firstly, think about what we might call pervasive control. From the chartered street to the chartered Thames, those in power have laid claim to everything. The government and the wealthy and their interests have mapped out and regulated the city's spaces. Even nature, the Thames, is bound by the constraints of society, leaving no freedom in the physical environment. But we also have corrupt institutions. The two major institutions Blake criticises specifically are the church and the monarchy. The church is depicted as blackening with soot and sin, a symbol of hypocrisy and moral failure. The palace, representing the crown and the government, is stained with the blood of its people. These institutions of power, which should provide moral leadership, guidance, and protection, are instead shown to be complicit in oppression. But we also have visible suffering. The consequences of this corruption are visible, but they're also audible. We can hear them everywhere, in every cry of every man, in the fearful cries of infants, in the sigh of the soldier, and in the curse of the harlot. Blake forces us to see and hear. This is like sensory overload almost. See and hear the human cost of abused power. London is portrayed as a living hell where suffering is commonplace and inescapable. But remember, it's a hell of our own construction. And that hellish restriction, that hellish corruption, has also tragically, painfully become internalized. The mind-forged manacles remind us that oppression isn't just external or imposed upon us. People's minds have been chained by propaganda, by fear, and by despair. But the most sinister aspect of power in London is its ability to make the oppressed believe that this misery, this way of being, this state of things is normal, as if these mental shackles were of their own making. And then finally, we have this cycle of despair. The poem suggests a vicious cycle in which oppression breeds more oppression. The suffering inflicted by institutions leads to individuals like the harlot to unintentionally spread pain to others, to her infant, to marriages. Innocence is continually, endlessly corrupted. This cycle will continue until the root causes, those abuses of power, are confronted directly. So in this poem, Blake is using masterfully, I have to say, imagery, symbolism, but also sound and the structure of the poem to make us not just understand, it's not just a work of history, but feel the effects of tyranny. That steady meter, the rhyme scheme, march us through the horror, like a forced tour we can't turn away from or shut our ears to. By the final lines, the reader is left with a very stark realization. When those in power act without compassion, the entire society decays from the inside out. Blake's poem was then a cry for awareness in his own time, but it still powerfully resonates today. Even now, we can find lessons in London about the importance of holding the rich and powerful to account and caring and thinking about and also humanizing the downtrodden. Perhaps the most lasting impression of the poem is that call for empathy and awareness. After walking with Blake through these haunted streets, we cannot ignore the suffering created by unchecked power. Remember, Blake is on the side of the downtrodden and not those in positions of power and wealth. Think back to that scene we imagined at the start, walking those midnight streets. Now we understand what lies behind this imagery. Every face is etched with weakness and woe, and it carries the weight of oppression. The infant crying in the night does so out of fear, born into a cruel, hellish world. The young harlot on the corner isn't just a sinner, but is a victim, cursing because society has cursed her first. The chimney sweeper's distant sob echoes because he's been forced into darkness by those who should protect him. Blake has given us the lens to see London clearly. This apparently great city reduced to a moral wasteland by the neglect of those in power. So next time you walk through a town or a city today, and you notice injustice or hardship, think of Blake's vision of London. Remember the mind-forged manacles and the faces marked with woe, and ask yourself, what can be done to break those manacles and replace those marks of woe with hope? Blake leaves us then with a warning, but also a challenge to recognize the chains in our own world and perhaps to help break them. So, as always, thank you so much for listening to this bonus additional episode of Study Sessions. I'm aware that next week we've got paper 2, There was no podcast on London. London is my favourite poem. There's a huge kind of gap in the study sessions list of podcast episodes, so I put that right today. I hope you enjoyed the episode. Hope you found it really, really useful. Make sure you're using this as part of your preparations for next week. And of course, the real thing later on this academic year.